Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay, first and foremost, I just want to thank all of the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this colloquium today. I think the idea of unruly design is really fascinating and exciting, and when Rachel asked me to give a paper, I immediately knew what I wanted to speak about, and specifically that I wanted to be in this Making the Rules section. Indeed, a through line in my research over the past 5 years, and I'm just finishing up my PhD now, has been the idea that clothing is a disciplinary mechanism, something that the sociologist Joanne Entwistle has argued transforms the flesh into something recognizable and meaningful to a culture, and are the means by which bodies are made decent within specific contexts. And anyone who has heard me present my research in the past year or even in the last week know that this is a quote that I've been returning to quite often. I think it's a good one. In pursuing this notion through various projects and papers, my research has taken a sweeping glance at the history of plus-size fashion over the long 20th century and has considered how fashions designed for larger women have functioned to discipline their unruly, disorderly bodies. Most recently, I've been looking at the early 20th century and into what was known as the stoutwear industry, or the historical precedent to plus-size fashion. In my talk today, I'm specifically going to look at how the technology of standard sizing informed the design of stout garments, policed the so-called stout woman's dangerous curves, and thereby gave shape to the discursive category of stout. Before doing so, however, it's worth providing some additional theoretical context. Throughout my research, Foucault's discussions about the relationship between knowledge, power, and discourse have served as a productive theoretical foundation. Indeed, as Foucault writes in Discipline and Punish, power produces. It produces reality, it produces domains of objects, and rituals of truth. According to Foucault, discourses are forms of power that do much more than designate or provide a language for talking about things. As he writes elsewhere in Discipline and Punish, they systematically form the objects of which they speak. In drawing upon this notion, it becomes possible to see how all bodies are subject to such discursive power regimes when it comes to dressing. Everyone adheres to certain spoken and unspoken rules of correct dress in order to avoid being scorned and ridiculed. However, some bodies are subject to more minute forms of policing. Throughout the 20th century, the fat female body has been subject to particularly rigid and unwavering conventions of dress. The adage that fat women should avoid horizontal stripes so as not to make themselves appear wider, or the general idea that it's inappropriate or indecently to show off cellulite or proudly brandish a fleshy tummy, are common examples of how fat women's bodies are disciplined through the clothes that they wear. Although obesity is oftentimes understood to be a malady of late capitalist societies, the policing of fat bodies goes back much farther. In the early 20th century, for example, stoutwear emerged to meet the needs of the so-called stout woman. The broadsheet from women's wear that you see reproduced here on the screen was actually one of the first articles to talk about the profitability of this subsector of the nascent ready-to-wear industry. Within the fashion media, this new race of stout women, as one manufacturer labeled them, was believed to be the product of a newly leisured lifestyle, and specifically of the intrusion of time and energy-saving innovations like the automobile and the vacuum cleaner, which, they claimed, were wreaking havoc on the waistlines of American women. Not coincidentally, it was also during this period that the modern weight loss industry was effectively born. Diet pills, rubber weight-reducing corsets, which you can see here, diet breads, and machines that promised to vibrate fat away, among other things, populated the pages of women's and fashion magazines and promised fast and at times dangerous routes to permanent weight loss. Within this context, early stoutwear entrepreneurs seized on the opportunity to market their wares as faster, safer, and more effective means to create the appearance of slenderness without actually changing the body. As you can see in this clipping from a 1916 article titled "How Science is Helping Stout People to Look Less Stout," a quote, "remarkable transformation is effected on the body of a stout woman through new scientifically designed stoutwear that employed the principles of optical illusion." Logic held that by drawing the eye upward instead of outward through the strategic application of lines, a fat body could be made to appear smaller without all of the time and energy spent required of actually losing weight. To invoke the language of Foucault again, all of these innovations, from diet regimes to stoutware, may be understood as political technologies of the body, or disciplinary regimes that embroil the body in a struggle to, quote, invest it, mark it, train it, torture it, force it to carry out tasks, to perform ceremonies, and to emit signs. Cumulatively, political technologies of the body create corpuses of knowledge through which bodily categories are both identified and experienced, and underscore how the body is shaped and disciplined by both physical and non-physical instruments of power. Political technologies of the body are therefore manifestations of what Foucault more generally described in the history of sexuality as biopower. Labeling the discourse of stoutware design as a political technology of the body, however, assumes that the fat female body is in need of discipline. Of course, this idea is all but taken for granted in contemporary society, and especially within the context of the sensational and pathologizing debates surrounding the obesity epidemic. However, the matter of why the fat body is so loathed or even feared within Western culture is one that's worth unpacking and historicizing a bit more. As the anthropologist Mary Douglas famously wrote in her book, Purity and Danger, margins are a source of great fear, suspicion, anxiety, and disgust. We fear those who exist on the margins of society, and perhaps more literally, we are disgusted when the margins of the normative body are broached, as through injury or sickness. Douglas therefore argued that the natural response to such disorder is systematic classification. Ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions, she writes, have as their main function to impose a system on an inherently untidy experience. Categories, she argues, are the means through which some semblance of order is created. They both explain disorder and create order. As this pertains to the present discussion, the fat body, much like the pregnant body or the diseased body, presses at and tests the limits of the normative body. Indeed, fat women do not conform to the cultural expectation of slenderness in women, which has been deeply entrenched in the collective consciousness throughout the 20th century, and thereby exist at the margins of femininity. Because of this, they are ambiguous, or to borrow the language of Julia Kristeva, their bodies are abject. Within this context, and because the fat woman's body is inherently untidy or unruly, it could be argued that stoutware emerged to institute order on the fat woman's dangerous curves. Indeed, a body can be fat so long as it is tight, contained, and has firm margins. Just think about the plus-size model, who more closely resembles an enlarged version of the slender ideal than she does an obese person who you might see on the nightly news. In making this claim, however, I'm getting somewhat ahead of myself. Indeed, in order to understand how stout and later plus-size fashions function as disciplinary mechanisms, it's necessary to understand the history of standard sizing, an institution and technology that overlaps with the history of stoutware in some really fascinating and meaningful ways. Although the United States excelled in the mass production of garments in almost all respects, one of the main issues that plagued the ready-to-wear industry from its inception was the matter of achieving precise fits amongst all consumers. From the 1860s through to the early 1900s, there was no single standard for grading and sizing garments in the mass market, which led to rampant problems in fit. Indeed, each retailer established their own rough standards, which more often than not were based on the measurements of a real fleshy body. Even so, a primitive system for sizing for men preceded one by women by several decades. While menswear statistics were first compiled in the 1860s and 70s in order to standardize military uniforms during the Civil War, a survey of female bodies was not conducted until 1884 at a number of women's colleges, such as Smith and Brooklyn's own Pratt Institute. In order to create a representative spectrum of sizes, these data were cross-referenced with height and weight tables that were produced by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in the early 1900s. However, given that these statistics were derived from a relatively narrow spectrum of body types, that of young, oftentimes affluent, oftentimes white, and more often than not slender women, women's sizing was from the outset doomed. Flawed as they may have been, however, it is through these early surveys and proportional theories that women's wear came to be classified into different size categories to accommodate youthful, middle-aged, and mature builds. Within these categories, the proportionate size ratios for grading garments up and down were based on bust measurements that generally ranged from 32 to 40 inches, or what today would roughly correspond to US sizes 2 to about 10 or 12. Alongside other turn-of-the-century tools that allowed bodies to be measured with greater intensity and more clarity, such as the penny scale and the film camera, accounting scholar Ingrid Jekyll has argued that sizing stands as an exemplary, if overlooked, political technology of the body for the manner it assigns a statistically generated number to every human form, and thereby creates categories of standard, but I argue also of non-standard bodies. Indeed, technologies like standard sizing did not merely present new ways for quantifying and measuring the body, as you can see in this chart from a 1928 fashion textbook. They also created the conditions through which bodies came to be seen as flawed. Within this context, the ability to measure one's body against a standard precipitated a confluence of two of the crucial control technologies of machine culture: statistics and surveillance. In other words, it was only really through the technology of standard sizing that the fat woman's body came to be seen and thereby known as unruly, deviant, and problematic. Different from her standard-sized counterparts, a woman whose body exceeded or went beyond the spectrum of standard sizes could not walk into a store and buy a garment off the rack. Because her body did not conform to pre-existing sizing standards, she was reflexively punished and forced to pay the price, quite literally, of custom tailoring or extensive alterations, while also being excluded from an essential experience of modernity. The stout body was therefore synonymous with failure because it defied the conventions of standard sizing, which thereby led to wasted labor and materials and shouldered manufacturers and retailers with costly aftermarket alterations. Indeed, to borrow the phrasing of Peter Corrigan, ready-made clothing demands ready-made bodies, or what Caroline Evans has described in her own work as the mechanical body of modernity. Within this context, as the French couturier Paul Poiret put so aptly in this article, the fat woman was simply hopeless. Her case was not for the dress designer, it was for the physician. However, and as a number of historians have noted, it's not as if people had grown suddenly fatter in the first decades of the 20th century. It was more so that tolerances had narrowed with the advent of new technologies that permitted the body's flaws to be measured with greater precision, among which standard sizing was crucial, even though it has largely been overlooked within extant cultural histories of the body, diet, and fat. Although people were not actually larger than they had been in the late 19th century, stoutware manufacturers nevertheless seized on this new data to promote to retailers the idea that stout women comprised 33% of the female buying public in the United States, and were therefore a valuable and overlooked consumer segment, even though there was almost no hard data to back these statistics up. One thing they did get right, however, was the fact that although fit was a problem for most American women during this time, stout women fared far worse than her more slender counterpart in the American ready-to-wear market. Indeed, based on these early surveys from Pratt and Smith, the so-called perfect 36 had been conceived as the base proportion from which all garments were graded up and down. The perfect 36, however, did not take into account the fact that bodies change shape and become less regular as they gain weight. In short, there was literally no room for the stout woman in fashion in the early 20th century. It was out of this sizing chaos, however, that stoutwear first emerged. In 1915, Albert Malson, the husband of Lena Bryant, who founded what today remains as one of the largest and most important retailers of plus-size clothing in the United States, Lane Bryant, undertook a survey of over 4,000 stout women in an attempt to solve the problem of fit. Through his findings, Malson confirmed that the old standards for cutting and grading garments were insufficient for fitting the stout women's bodies because they were based on a single standard. At the same time, however, Malson implemented new and even more exacting ways to measure the stout woman's deviance through the creation of even more categories. Indeed, from this data, he conceived of a new sizing system that was based on the idea that stout women's bodies fell into not one, but into three categories: the full-busted type, the flat-busted type, and the stout all-over type. Although flawed, Malson's sizing system was taken up widely across the industry, and notably even by his closest competitor, the Associated Stylish Stoutwear Makers. And vestiges of this practice persist to this day through categories like the apple, pear, and hourglass. Since Americans had not suddenly grown fatter around the turn of the century, the anxiety surrounding fat may be attributed to the narrowing of tolerances and the concurrent establishment of a new normal. Indeed, I argue that it was through this process of quantifying the stout body in and through the discourses and conventions of standard sizing, and specifically through pseudoscientific statistics like those which claimed that more than 1/3 of all American women were stout, that the stout body itself became something that was verifiable, knowable, and increasingly visible, and therefore subject to regimes of containing and controlling it. Returning to a point with which I began this talk, stoutwear was promoted within the fashion media not as something that would fit the stout woman and therefore level the proverbial playing field for her. Rather, it was explicitly marketed as a more effective means to transform the appearance of her unruly body, in lieu of more difficult, time-consuming, and dangerous means of permanently eradicating fat. Although I don't have time to go into much detail here, these Lane Bryant advertisements dating to between 1924 and 1928 very clearly evidence what I deem the slenderness imperative of stoutwear design discourse. On the cover of the catalog, for instance, Lane Bryant is quite forthright about their slenderizing fashions for stout women, while in the right they signal to the stout woman with the phrase, "if you are not slender," both of which attest to just how deeply entrenched the slenderness imperative was, not only within fashion discourse, but within the public imaginary at large. To conclude, however, I want to return one last time to the issue of sizing and present some final thoughts. Within the context of American ready-to-wear, the very conventions of standard sizing were built upon a flawed foundation, which took as its basis not a real body, but a statistical pastiche, exemplified perhaps by the ideal of the perfect 36, one which scorned averages in favor of ideals. The stout body, however, stands as an exemplary illustration of how bodies that flout social codes are subject at attempts to control and contain them. It may be said that standardization ultimately breeds standard bodies, or better, ideal bodies. However, in spite of stoutwear manufacturers' attempts to create a rational foundation for grading large-size garments, the stout body ultimately resisted such attempts to define and standardize it, a notion that is underscored by the persistent problems in fit which plagued the industry until its demise in the early 1930s. Thus, and somewhat paradoxically, the stout body was one that was defined through the very impossibility of defining it. Indeed, what mattered more than the exact proportions or measurements of the stout body was the fact that it was beyond or outside of the norm. Thank you.